Hi and welcome to this probably very different video from what you're used to seeing on this channel. I'm D.A. Edwards and this is all about how I recorded my new piece Inspector Tabby on the Hunt for the Vanished Caravan. But wait, what does a recording with real musicians have to do with virtual instruments? And what is this doing on the Vienna Symphonic Library YouTube channel? Well, let me show you. In this video, I'll walk you through my composing process, how I use VSL as a tool for working with musicians, how I organized and produced my own recording, and how VSL is a part of every step in this process, all while I'll give you handy tips for your own projects. Let's get into it. Part 1. What actually can be the use of virtual instruments for concert music? So every composer of course has their own unique way of doing things, and generally speaking whatever gets you to where you need to be is the right way to do it. But it's also good to every now and then take a look at how other people do things, so you might get some new ideas for your own approach. The way I do it is when I get a new idea for a piece in my head, start figuring things out in my mind and start composing, I first bring it into our real world by creating a mock-up in my digital audio workstation. But instead of a mock-up, I prefer to call it a digital interpretation, because that's what it is to me. Now you might think that that is a lot of work for something that will never be heard. After all, my goal is for this to be performed and recorded. But I have 3 reasons for doing it this way, instead of writing it down in Sibelius or a piece of paper. Number 1 is the immediate feedback you get. You should always trust in your inner hearing, and that's actually how I compose too. But this is a way of setting things in stone in a clearly defined and less fluid way, like when everything is coming together in your head. So this can be like a conversation with yourself, or as if you were already in rehearsals. You can then show this to people at a very early stage and communicate ideas, but more on that later. Secondly, and for me personally more important, this is a way for me to express my own music, and that is exactly why I call it a digital interpretation. If you're not just a composer but happen to play the instruments you write for, then perhaps you can play and even perform your own music. But if you write something for multiple performers, or something that just goes beyond your abilities as a performer, then really all you can do is imagine how things should sound and then refine things in rehearsals with the musicians. But with this, I can create a version of my music that anyone can hear even before it's ever been performed. And it's giving the people, and especially the musicians around me that I'm working with, a much better and more detailed idea of what my intentions actually are. And this leads me right into reason number 3. This is an amazing tool for rehearsals and practice sessions for musicians, and an incredible communication tool for me. Sheet music is a great way for communicating a decent amount of ideas for performing the music, but we don't see music with our eyes, we hear it with our ears. Sometimes we just need to listen. We need to hear it ourselves to understand how we feel or want to feel about it. For any of you who've performed music before that isn't your own, and that you've never heard before, you know how hard it is to build that interpretation and figure out what did the composer want. And sometimes there are these miscommunications, even when you're communicating directly with the composer. And that's no different on the other side for us composers.
Das verstehe ich nicht.
Okay. Wie soll ich sagen? Failing to communicate and feeling at a loss for words and being unable to express what you mean is incredibly frustrating. So why only use words when today we can show it? One way that a musician develops their tastes and preferences, which shapes their own interpretation of a piece, is the interpretations by others they're exposed to, be it when attending a concert or listening to recordings. I think this is something that every musician does subconsciously, so whether they realize it or not, they are to some extent using existing performances as reference for their own. But of a new piece, such an existing performance of course couldn't possibly exist, but now it can. So even though this digital interpretation won't be heard by many people, it still is a key component of my composing process and for rehearsals. Even after a concert or recording, it remains as a reference for a baseline of my ideas, which is also why I keep it accessible to anyone who wants to perform my music, and I link to it in my sheet music. But all that is not to say that such a digital interpretation cannot hold up on its own. My Synocoda Symphony, for example, is released on CD, and that is just the version I made with the VSL Synchron series. But before I get too far off track, let's jump right into Part 2. How did Inspector Tabby come to be? So I'm very lucky in that I have 2 professional musicians as parents, my mother being a professional pianist and my father a professional clarinetist. One of his students, Marlon Goebel, decided to participate in a clarinet competition, which his decision was kind of late, with only a couple of months to spare until the competition. But still, when I got word of that, I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice to compose something new for him to play. So I suggested it to him, which he was very excited about because he had already played a piece by me the previous year. So he kind of knew what he was getting into, but he still wanted to do it, and he wanted it to be a challenge.
Also einerseits war es natürlich eine große Ehre extra, dass für mich dieses Stück für den Wettbewerb komponiert wurde. Auf der anderen Seite war es natürlich auch eine große Verantwortung, die mit einhergegangen, weil natürlich der Komponist dann gleich neben mir saß und mir genau sagen konnte und ich dann diesen Druck hatte, quasi das umzusetzen. Aber das war an der anderen Seite natürlich auch eine große Möglichkeit zu wachsen.
So with only a couple of months until the competition, I went to work on Inspector Tappy right away. For the story, I somehow got visuals and ideas in my head for a detective cat who was sent on a mission to retrieve a missing art piece that was transported on a mysteriously vanished caravan. So with the basic story outline set, I allowed myself to explore this adventure together with Tabby as I was composing it. And because I do that while I'm writing and working on this digital interpretation, I got done with the entire piece within a week, at which point I could then send it to Marlon, which he could already listen to, while I was still working on converting it to readable sheet music. And that's one of the great things about this workflow. Since you're already working in a digital environment, it's very easy to translate between different formats and software. So unlike one might assume, you're not actually doing double the amount of work. The only thing you might have to do when translating from your DAW to your engraving software is that you might have to adjust the MIDI notation to be quantized perfectly on grid, so that the engraving software doesn't try to translate humanized input or input with delays and small timing offsets from the interpretation, which it would then try to interpret with really crazy note values. And then from there, it's all about making the sheet music readable, which is actually my favorite part about this process, because then you're really left to writing in all the dynamic markings, expressions, and really working on the layout for the sheet music. Oh, and by the way, at the end of the story, Inspector Tabby actually finds out that the vanished caravan is the name of the missing art piece. Now, before we really go into the rehearsals, the competition, the concerts, and the recording, I first want to give you some insight into the digital interpretation and how I created it. Part 3. How I bring my digital interpretations to life. So now we're looking at my original project. This is where I did all the composing and where I created my digital interpretation. So I went with the Synchron Fazioli F308, which I think is a fantastic grand piano. It sounds incredible, and it allowed me to create a very lifelike interpretation of the piano part. And for the clarinet, I went with Clarinet 1 from the Synchron Woodwinds. Even though I'm using it as a pure solo instrument, it still did a fantastic job of keeping up with my ones. So let's just take a listen to it. So of course, at the start, I would like it if it would enter even more aggressively, which is of course then what you do in rehearsals with the musicians. But you can see it's giving you a pretty good idea of what I want already, especially the parts here with these notes. You really get a sense of the expression I want here, the lines I want the dynamics to follow. And then of course, this is where I really love working with this way, because of course you can sort of get an idea across with dynamics in Sibelius or Finale or whatever you use. But here you get a lot more control over the nuances you really want. If we look at the key switches here, so you see I'm switching between the short staccato and the long staccato, staccatissimo staccato, who knows, and then going to the long portato. So this is something which is really bringing this digital interpretation to life, switching through all these different playing modes, even if they're not necessarily what you'd write in the sheet music. Let's take, for example, a later moment in the piece. So this run going down, as you can see in my arrangement here, you're not seeing what it's actually doing. If I just did it with a legato patch, it sounds really smeary. It doesn't sound as precise. So what I did here is I took a trill patch. And since we're in legato mode over here, if I time the in trigger just right, it will do the beginning of the trill and go right into the next one, do the next trill. So this is why it sounds really realistic. So this is where the timing, you have to really tweak to get it just right. and then I'm ending it with the legato patches here again. These are the kind of tricks I'm doing here to make this interpretation come to life. Later in the sheet music, you can of course write it in properly. This is just the kind of stuff you have to deal with when working with these software instruments. But I think it's worth the time, because it doesn't take a lot of time to do. So I think it's worth that extra tiny bit of time just to get this sounding right. It's better for me while I'm converting it to sheet music, nicer to listen to. I can better show people what I want it to sound like, and everyone's happy. I think that's really impressive when looking at the software, but also really useful, because you can really get people that sense, that feeling of, this is what I want this to feel like, this is what it might feel like in the concert hall too. This is a section that really highlights why I like this approach so much, especially in rehearsals with musicians, because this really is something that is kind of difficult to express with sheet music. In the end, in the score, I decided to go with a couple of hairpins. You kind of know what I want, but this is really down to interpretation. You can try to explain it, but showing is always better than telling. This is where such a digital interpretation is really powerful. But now it's time to leave the computer, so let me take you with me into the rehearsals, the competition, the concert, and the recording. Part 4. From software to concert. The first time you're in rehearsals with a new piece is always a bit scary. You never know for sure if everything is really going to work out, if it actually sounds right in person with the real instrument right there in front of you. But because of the realism of the virtual instruments, most potential technical problems already arose while I made the digital interpretation. So for me then in the rehearsals, I could really focus on the expression. Marlon did a really good job of very quickly adapting to and realizing changes that I wanted in his performance, because he had already a pretty good idea of what I wanted.
Es ist wieder so eine Szene, wo du dir vorstellen musst, dass du hast diesen Dam, 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 ne? Dam, Dam, und du musst dich da aufbauen, Dam, 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 und dann, Vorsicht, Dam, 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 ein bisschen ausweichen, genau.
So it was more about correcting some things here and there and explaining the story to him.
Was mir immer sehr geholfen hat bei der Probe natürlich ist, dann immer von dir die ganzen Geschichten, die ich mir an den Stellen denken muss. Das hat mir auch sehr geholfen, mir das so zu verbildlichen. Ich weiß, auch dieser Zug, der an mir vorbeifährt oder sowas, sowas ist auch immer noch im Gedächtnis geblieben, und es hat mir auch geholfen, dann jetzt bei anderen Stücken da besser ranzugehen, um mir das eben so in andere Kontexte zu übertragen und dann daran quasi mir auszumachen, wie die Stelle jetzt gemeint sein soll.
I think you should always give musicians as much to work with as possible. I like to tell them about the world, the stories I envision in the music. The more a musician has to work with, the better. So when they have the expression and dynamics written in the sheet music, the digital interpretation, and if they know about the story behind the music, they have a lot to work with and have a pretty good picture of what I want to express with the piece and how they can translate that into their performance. So then with all that done, we drove to Wetzlar for the competition. Now, one really unlucky thing that happened was that Marlon was on antibiotics that day because he was fighting some kind of cold. He did fine in the dress rehearsals, but in a competition, when you're dealing with all that extra stress, a few things just didn't end up working out quite as well as he would have otherwise been able to do. The audience was made up only of the other competitors and the jury. So for me, it was really a very strange feeling and not the perfect setting for a premiere. I think what I've learned from this experience is that a new piece, this new thing you're letting free into the world, needs an audience. But a month later, Marlon performed the piece again, but this time it was the soloist concert of his music school.
Marlon had a chance to perform the piece in front of an audience, fairly large audience. It was very successful, and I think that was very nice for all of us, and especially, of course, for Marlon.
Marlon did really good, it was a great success, and to me, it was the real premiere of Inspector Tabby. Even though the piece was composed for Marlon's participation in the competition, like most composers, I want many people to play my music. And luckily for me, I already know another really great clarinetist. My father, as his teacher, had rehearsed the piece with Marlon, so it was only natural that he should take the opportunity to play it himself. He also studied the piece to perform it in concerts, so we decided to do a proper recording in a really nice venue for the online and CD release of Inspector Tabby.
Also Vorbereitung ist ja klar, man bereitet sich eigentlich genauso vor wie vor einem Konzert. Man denkt, manchmal sind Sachen ein bisschen anders, muss man anders herausheben.
You go in and you have the feeling, I'm prepared, and then when you start you have the feeling, oh, I'm not prepared enough. It always seems to be that way, and in earlier recordings the engineer once said, when you walk out of the studio, then you really know the piece and you can really play the piece, and I think that's quite right.
So we of course went into even more rehearsals for the recording, and we did some finishing touches on the sheet music.
So schon. Was war das?
A recording is obviously very different from a concert. You're able to do multiple takes of the piece, and everything happens in a much more controlled environment. Or let's say, when things go wrong, you can just re-record it. Since you're not playing for an audience, but you're playing essentially for the microphones, you and the musicians have to really think differently about how you approach a recording compared to a concert.
A recording is always something for eternity. You want to have it perfect. And I think recording is very hard. It takes a lot of patience. And what I always find very challenging in recordings is to not let it sound purely perfect and technical, but to let the experience of a concert or the feeling of a concert or a performance carry over into the recording so that the recording will sound alive.
Als wir reingekommen sind, war natürlich toll. Wow, es ist ein großer Saal, er hat eine schöne Akustik, da kann man viel machen.
Now we did the setup the day before the recording to give us as much time as possible to experiment and get things just right. Because we were in this big, beautiful venue, I wanted to capture a lot of the room tone. Because I really love experimenting with different miking techniques, I decided to build my own Decca-tree, which is most commonly used for orchestra recordings and film music, but also for smaller ensembles, and especially when you want to capture all the natural sound of the environment. Okay. Bereit? Okay, Aufnahme läuft. During a recording, the hardest part for me is to stay alert, to keep listening and looking out for mistakes and for problems. You can easily get focused on one little thing because there's nothing worse than returning home, listening back to the recording and realizing we did this take 20, 30 times, and every single time we got this part just right, but we missed something here. Now, at the end of the recording day, we packed up all of the gear, cleaned up, and we drove home. Now, leaving that place really felt kind of strange, and I think you're always going to leave a recording with a bit of uncertainty. But then, back here in the studio, and going through all the takes and slowly figuring things out, it became apparent that this was a pretty good recording. But first was the process of selecting takes. And even though this is my piece, I want to talk about that with the musicians, because it is their playing, their interpretation at the end of the day.
Ja, das war im zweiten Teil und der Schluss ist gut und der Anfang halt.
We then slowly went through everything together and slowly started to reconstruct the interpretation.
Sowas machen und das ist halt da nicht. Er kommt nicht stark genug rüber eigentlich dafür, um die Wirkung zu haben. Deshalb würde ich ihn vielleicht tatsächlich wegmachen.
Ich finde, dazu ist die Überraschung auch größer.
Even in classical music, there's a lot of editing that can be done that no one will ever notice. Now, some people really do record everything in one single continuous take, though usually that is most common for concert recordings. But what we did was really working in segments, in tiny, short segments. So you can see here, these are quite a lot of edits, a couple of tricks here and there to get things to blend together just right. In this instance, for example, we really liked what the piano did, but there was some issues in the clarinet, so since we had the direct recordings of the instrument, I was able to splice together 2 separate takes and overlay that with each other and on top of the Decca tree. A good strategy for recording takes is to take segments of a couple of measures long for each take, while making sure to then leave a bit of overlap. Now, if you didn't do that, your takes would align right at that transition point. It would pretty much be impossible to splice that together. But if you do it with the overlap, then you can find, later in the edit, a really nice spot for aligning the takes. And then, of course, finding a nice spot where you're gonna put the cut and a nice soft transition. So after everything was done with the edit, it was time to mix and master the recording. This is where VSL comes in again. I did some very tiny adjustments with the Vienna Equalizer Pro from the Vienna Suite Pro, just because I really liked the natural sound of the microphones and I didn't need to do many adjustments. I then also added a tiny amount of artificial reverb to the more direct signal from the closed microphones, using the convolution reverb from the Vienna Suite, just to blend together the more direct sound from the closed microphones a bit better with the very spacious sound from the Decca tree. After that, it was time for some finishing touches here and there, doing the final exports, and then it was time to listen to the recording on a bunch of different setups, different speakers, different environments, just to get a better feel for how the recording sounds on different equipment. And then it's also a good idea to take some time away from the recording and not listen to it at all for a while, so you can come back later with fresh ears and see if there's anything you didn't notice before. But in the end, everything was fine. I was really happy with the recording. I edited the music video and prepared everything for the release. Now, there was already another small concert with Inspector Tabby, and there are going to be a few more concerts this year. But that is the end of the journey for this video, and that is how you go from software to concert.
Thank you so much for watching this video. Now, if you like, you can listen to the full recording of Inspector Tabby on the Hunt for the Vanished Caravan over on my YouTube channel, or you can listen to the MIDI version right here on the Vienna Symphonic Library YouTube channel. All relevant links are in the video description down below. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.